I had a child with a New York big shot, Garen. Everyone thought I'd use this to blackmail him into marrying me. But on the 10th day after giving birth, I left New York alone. Garen came after me, holding the baby, his eyes red as he looked at me and said, "Alexia, you don't want me, and now you don't even want our child." I couldn't help but shed a tear, but I didn't turn back. I just gazed at the vast, free sky in the distance and calmly said, "Yes, I don't want either you or the baby." After I said that, Garen turned around with a crying baby in his arms and left. His background and pride made it astonishing enough that he chased me to the airport. But this wasn't the first time Garen and I had separated. We broke up 3 years ago. The day before our breakup, in his luxurious office on the top floor, he personally removed my clothes, one by one, from that priceless wooden desk. I lay on the desk, shyly closing my eyes. Garen leaned over and kissed me, saying, "Alexia, do you know, every time you come in to report, I only have one thought in my mind, to have you right on this desk." That afternoon, his office door was locked tight. His confidential secretary and personal assistant stood guard outside for a full 3 hours. Exhausted, I was lifted from the desk and carried to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. From the heart of New York's prime real estate, everything seemed insignificant like ants. "Alexia," Garen embraced me from behind, his hot kisses on my ear. "It's almost your birthday. What gift do you want?" My fingers traced what marks on the cold glass. My reflection, with spring-like eyes and shimmering tears, wavered and finally shattered, with tears falling one by one. I reached back to grasp his hand tightly. "Garen, I just want to be with you." He seemed to laugh quietly, then turned me around and held me tightly against his chest. Fool, hadn't we always been together? I was indeed foolish. I only found out he had been dating his fiancée for a year when he was about to get engaged. During that year, he often flew to France, not for business but to see his future wife. On the day I handed in my resignation, the sky was overcast and unbearably hot. I stood in front of that desk, staring down at my shoes. Garen, looking displeased, hesitated to sign. I didn't rush him. Instead, I calmly brought up an old matter. "Do you remember the accident 2 years ago? The Valentine family went bankrupt, and their young master hired someone to attack you. I took a knife for you." I smiled, looking at Garen with my swollen eyes. "You promised me you would agree to one thing and never go back on your word." I didn't know what to ask of you then. "But Garen, I know now. Let's end things completely." Garen's gaze was deep as he looked at me. The gold pen he was holding made a black mark on the white paper. Finally, he spoke. "Alexia." He called my name, but said nothing more, only signing the document and pushing the resignation report towards me. I took it, glanced at his signature, and bowed slightly. "Garen, thank you." With my resignation, breakup, and packing done, I began working and going on dates. I thought I'd never see Garen again, but 2 years later, fate brought us face to face once more. It was summer in New York. I was sweltering, and had just eaten 2 ice creams to cool down. When I turned around, I saw Garen surrounded by a crowd, walking towards me. After a brief moment of disorientation, I kept my head down and blended into the crowd. The venue was huge, and there were so many people. I was just a small employee. No one would notice me. But Garen came over. His bodyguards and personal assistant stopped anyone trying to approach him. In the middle of the massive venue, the man in a black tailored business suit looked as majestic and distant as a deity. The venue fell silent. I kept my head bowed, saying nothing and not looking at him. After about a minute, Garen suddenly stepped forward. He took the half-melted ice cream I was hiding behind my back, still not afraid of cramps. A low gasp came from the crowd, but soon it was quiet again. Garen wiped his hands clean and calmly said, "Go wait in my car. I'll be there shortly." If it weren't for the engagement ring still on my left hand, and if I hadn't just finished a video call with my fiancé 20 minutes ago, I might have thought time had stood still for 2 years. Garen and I had never been apart. I was still in New York, young and passionate, loving with all my heart, but I was only momentarily dazed. Then I looked up, bowed respectfully, and smiled. "Sorry, Garen, I still have work to do." Garen's anger didn't flare, but his voice grew colder. "Alexia, don't make me angry." I took a deep breath. "Sorry, I need to get back to work." "Garen." The surroundings were so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. Even his secretary of 10 years looked at me in surprise. I appeared calm, but my back was already drenched with sweat. Knowing his background and influence, I understood how dangerous it was to offend him. He once settled a huge issue for my family with just one word. To show him no respect was almost like asking for trouble. But Garen suddenly laughed softly. "Alexia, I never knew you had such a temper." He didn't force me further, but seemed to lose interest and left the venue with his entourage. For 3 days, I was on edge, but nothing happened. My heart slowly began to settle. However, on the day I was heading home, I received a call from my fiancé. "Joyce." "Alexia, what did you do to anger someone?" Why are they targeting me like this? Family and friends invested all their money in my company. It was their life's work, their hard-earned money, and now it's all gone. Alexia, please, can you ask that person to spare me? If he refuses, Alexia, I might have to jump from the building. Joyce was crying and laughing, her voice hoarse, holding the phone. I felt icy cold all over. After a while, I spoke quietly. Joyce, who is this person you're talking about? I only know his last name is Welch, and he's a secretary. The hot tears in my eyes suddenly hit the phone screen. Hamilton Welch, Garen's trusted confidant. He had been with him for 10 years. It was the peak of summer in New York. The 10 o'clock evening breeze was still warm. The black car was low-key yet luxurious, smoothly navigating through the night. It felt like I had returned to that night many years ago. Hamilton Welch had picked me up back then too. I was only 21 at the time. Seeing Garen wrapped in just a towel was enough to make me want to cry. Garen found it amusing and comforted me a little. Now, at 26, wearing an engagement ring, I have a fiancé and am about to start a new life. But I knew that after tonight, everything would turn into a mirage. Garen stood on the terrace, smoking a navy blue robe. I walked in, without saying a word, and went straight to the bathroom. When I came out of the bathroom, I was naked. Garen put out his cigarette, leaning against the railing, watching me. He looked me up and down for a while before shaking his head and sighing. You've lost weight. I numbly looked at him and said, Garen, do whatever you want afterward. Can you spare my fiancé? Alexia, if you're asking me for another man, it only makes me more angry. Garen's eyes were cold as he focused on my ring. Throw that thing away. I immediately removed the ring, tossing it into the trash without a glance. Garen's expression softened slightly. Come here. I walked up to him. He reached out and touched my face, his long fingers tracing downward. The moonlight fell on the silver hill, a gentle and beautiful white, but that white soon shattered. I turned my face away, staring at the gentle moonlight. Tears flowed silently, until Garen bent down and bit my cherry, making me wince in pain. He then held me, his eyes filled with faint tenderness. Don't be so stubborn, just like before. If you tease me, what won't I agree to? He said, pressing me against the floor-to-ceiling window. When I saw you at the venue today, I wanted to do this. He gripped my waist without any tenderness. I couldn't help but struggle, but he held me down with cold force. Behave if you don't want him to die. I immediately stopped moving. Moments later, Garen seemed dissatisfied and slapped my backside roughly. You know what I like about you? When Garen carried me back to the bed, I was already completely exhausted. He looked satisfied but eager to continue. I closed my eyes, my voice hoarse. I'm really tired, Garen. In the dim light, Garen looked down at me. He pinched my chin and said, all right, I'll let you off for tonight. He got up and went to the bathroom. I managed to sit up. Garen lit a cigarette and watched me struggle to get out of bed. He then walked over to the sofa to get his clothes. His gaze turned colder and colder. What are you doing? Going back. I lowered my eyes and put on my clothes, one piece at a time. Going back where? Back home. Garen suddenly laughed. You're still so naive. My hands trembled for no reason, but I kept going, zipping up my dress and putting on my shoes. Garen crushed the half-lit cigarette in the ashtray, the glowing tip turning to broken ash. Alexia. I turned and walked towards the door, as if I hadn't heard him at all. He didn't say another word. He didn't even try to stop me. When I went downstairs, the servant and driver were already waiting. They greeted me politely. Alexia, Garen instructed us to drive you. I numbly nodded. Garen's driver dropped me off at the airport and then left. Even as I boarded the plane, I felt like I was in a dream. He had just let me go. What he didn't know was that, despite the time we spent together, I never really understood how terrifying Garen could be. I initially thought that after that night, with the dissolution of my engagement with Joyce, we'd be done with each other. I didn't expect Garen to make things difficult for anyone else, but I didn't anticipate that this was just the beginning. Joyce's small company started facing constant turmoil. Garen's people seemed to play with him like a cat with a mouse. They would give him a glimmer of hope when he was on the brink of collapse, only to hit him hard when he tried to recover. After several rounds of this, Joyce could no longer endure it. He even contemplated ending it all. Thankfully, he was rushed to the hospital in time and saved. I went to the hospital to see Joyce, but I didn't enter the ward. I only handed the fruits and supplements I brought to Joyce's parents. As I was leaving the hospital, I received a call from Hamilton Welch. Alexia, Garen wants to know when you'll be back in New York. Holding the phone, I stood under the scorching sun, drenched in sweat, yet I felt like I was in an ice cave. Despite this, I stubbornly refused to back down. I'm not going back. Hamilton Welch said nothing and hung up immediately. Perhaps Garen thought that Joyce's situation couldn't affect me anymore, or maybe he felt that pressuring a woman like this was beneath him and pointless. After that call, everything was calm until late autumn. My parents still felt upset and regretful when they mentioned Joyce, But as time passed, they began to cheer up and tried to arrange blind dates for me again. In winter, Garen got married. His new wife was the young lady he met while studying in France. The news came on a day with bad weather, reminiscent of the day I broke up with him. Their wedding was very low-key for some reason, with not a single photo leaked. On my way home from work, I bought a serving of Odin and Saturday on a bench by the roadside, eating it bite by bite. Towards the end, it somehow tasted a bit salty. The remaining broth rippled with small waves. I was startled to find tears streaming down my face, though I wasn't aware when I had started crying. That night, after I showered and came out of the bathroom, while chatting with my parents on the sofa, my phone rang with an unknown number. I didn't answer and hung up. Moments later, I received a message. Alexia, are you coming down, or should I come up? Just those few words made my spine break out in a cold sweat. The phone rang again. I turned off the sound and went back to my room before answering. On the other end was indeed Garen's voice. Garen, what do you want? I tried to keep my voice steady, but couldn't hide the anger in my heart. Alexia, I miss you. I hesitated for a moment, and then put the phone down, preparing to hang up. If you don't come, I'll have to visit your parents. I instinctively looked back from the living room. I could hear the lively sound of the TV and my parents' laughter. My heart felt tightly entwined with these sounds, growing increasingly painful. I'll come down. All right, I'll wait for you. After hanging up, I quickly put on a coat and made up an excuse to my parents before heading downstairs. Garen's car was parked in the shadow of a tree by the roadside. I tightened my coat and glanced around like a thief before swiftly walking to the car. The rear window lowered a third of the way. Garen Saturday there, looking relaxed. When I approached, his gaze met mine, and a faint smile gradually appeared in his eyes. Get in. If there's something you need to say, just say it. I refused to get in the car. Garen didn't force me. He just nodded. All right, I'll come out. He opened the car door and got out. But the next moment, he grabbed my chin and pushed me against the car. His scorching kiss, laced with a faint smell of alcohol, overwhelmed me like a tidal wave. I tried to struggle, but couldn't make a sound. In the confusion, I slapped his face. My freshly grown nails left 3 blood streaks on his jaw. Garen suddenly let go, his expression darkening. I was frightened and took a few steps back. He touched the wound, his eyes narrowing just as I thought he might retaliate. He simply curled his lips into a faint smile. Alexia, are you getting in the car with me, or do you want me to handle things right here? Choose for yourself. You know I can do anything. My parents were upstairs. The neighbors nearby had known me for years. It was still early in the night. Someone could come out at any moment. In the end, I got into the car. Throughout the drive, Garen didn't say another word. When we arrived at his hotel, he took off his suit jacket and pressed me against the door as soon as we walked in. My wrists were tied with his tie. Raised above my head, my coat was ripped open, and my nightgown was bunched up messily. He unbuckled his belt, pulled out his shirt from his trousers, and unzipped his pants. I cried silently, my eyes swollen and red, staring at him fiercely. Garen, why are you doing this? Why must you make me endure such humiliation? Stop now, and I won't hate you. Hate me. Garen suddenly laughed. Alexia, I'd rather you hate me. It's better than being like a stranger, with no ties and no concern. You've really gone mad. Garen, yeah, I'm mad. He held my waist and entered slowly, like a dull blade cutting through flesh. My tears flowed endlessly, but he showed no pity. His movements were fast and rough, as if he wanted to shatter me. Later, he carried me to the floor-to-ceiling window. I knelt there for a long time, my knees almost rubbed raw and swollen. In the final instance, he carried me back to the bed. I felt like I was on the verge of breaking apart, but Garen still wouldn't let up. I couldn't control my body's instinctive reactions, being sent to Cloud 9 over and over again. Alexia, will you come back to New York with me? I shook my head, eyes tightly closed, shaking my head with all my strength. Garen looked down, smiled, but still grew angry. I couldn't endure it any longer, choking out a plea. But he remained unmoved, looking down at me with cold indifference. If you're so disobedient, why should I feel sorry for you? Just bear with it, Alexia. The next morning, Garen returned to New York. As before, he didn't force me or do anything as absurd as dragging me to New York. But it wasn't long before my father's previous case, which Garen had supposedly settled with a word, was suddenly reopened. My parents, upon hearing the news, fell with anxiety. I tried to intercede, considering Garen initially helped, because my father was indeed an innocent scapegoat pushed out by his superiors. But no matter how hard I tried, it was in vain. That night, I was unceremoniously pushed out of the house with gifts in tow. In the cold winter night, I didn't cry. Instead, when waiting for the green light at the intersection, I suddenly dropped the expensive boxes and laughed. I laughed until I was doubled over, tears streaming uncontrollably. Passers-by looked at me as if I were crazy, but I didn't care. Hamilton Walsh's call came again. The line was the same as before. Alexia, Garen wants to know when you'll be back in New York. Standing in the cold wind, I wrapped my coat tightly around myself. The signal light changed, and people came and went. I stood alone on the crosswalk, unmoving. The caller on the other end seemed patient, not rushing me. I don't remember how long I stood there. When my legs and feet had gone numb from the cold, I finally spoke. Tell Garen to come see me. I need to clarify something with him first. 2 days later, everything returned to square one, as if nothing had happened. Garen indeed came to see me. He stayed at my family home for 3 days, but I barely saw him during this time. He seemed extremely busy with social engagements. I was glad for the peace and quiet. On the third night, he returned home with a faint smell of alcohol. I was still awake, sitting on the terrace, staring into space. Garen approached, stood behind me, and placed his hands on my shoulders, kissing my cheek. Don't go to sleep yet. Wait for me a moment. He then went to the bathroom, showered, and came out in a casual bathrobe. Hamilton Walsh said, "You have something to tell me." "What is it?" He sat her next to me, pulling me into his arms, his voice heavy. "I won't be a mistress or a second wife." Garen seemed not the least bit surprised. He even chuckled softly. "I didn't plan to hide that from you. I'm in a contract marriage with her." I gazed out at the expansive sky beyond the terrace, speaking calmly. "Whether it's a contract or not doesn't concern me. The fact is, you're married." I turned my face to look at him. "So even if we talk about it till the ends of the earth, you're married, and if I sleep with you, it means I'm the shameless mistress." Garen's eyes darkened. "If I say you're not, then no one else in this world would dare to say you are. You don't need to discuss this with me." I laughed bitterly. "Anyway, this is my bottom line. If you force me, then it's death." "Alexia." Garen grasped my chin. "Do you think threatening me with death will scare me? Death is simple. But what about your family who's still alive?" My whole body started to tremble, my teeth chattering together with a squeaking sound. My tear ducts felt painfully swollen, yet no tears would fall. It felt as if my spine had suddenly been pulled out. I felt like a ragdoll, completely limp. Garen's fingers, which had been gripping my jaw, loosened their hold slightly. He lifted his other hand to brush away the stray strands of hair from my cheek. "All right," he said, then leaned down and placed a kiss on the corner of my icy, trembling lips. "Don't keep these words on your lips. I would never wrong you." Garen turned his face and cleared his throat, seeming somewhat uncomfortable. "You're a woman I like. After all, do you really think I make things hard for you?" His voice was gentle, and his gaze was soft as he looked at me. In that moment of despair, it felt like I had grasped at a lifeline. "Garen," I looked up at him, tears finally streaming down my face. "Garen, I promise I won't date, go on blind dates, or get married again. During your marriage, we shouldn't meet or have any contact. Is that okay?" Garen didn't respond. He just looked down at me from his elevated position. I had never seen such a cold, deep gaze before. It was like a hellish abyss, swallowing me whole. "Alexia, let's do this," he said. "My wife can't have children. If you give me a child, I'll fulfill your request. After that, if you want no further ties with me, so be it. Think it over before you answer me." Garen brushed the stray hair from my forehead. The coldness in his eyes melted just a bit. "I'll give you 3 days. In fact, I didn't need 3 days. By the second day after he returned to the capital, I had made up my mind. I knew I couldn't change anything. I also couldn't let go of my closest relatives. So even death wouldn't be an option. But at least one thing I could fight for. When I walked into Garen's office again, I felt like I was in another world. In addition to Garen and me, there were 2 lawyers present. I watched Garen sign the contract and press his seal. I did the same. I said before, the child won't be an illegitimate one. He will be Garen's first child, I said, and a legitimate descendant of the Carroll family. After the lawyers left, Garen pulled me into his arms and repeated those 2 sentences. I'd ignored him, carefully storing away the contract. Then, when he leaned in to kiss me, I pushed him away. "Let's do it tomorrow night. Come over tomorrow night," I said, my voice unnervingly calm, even surprising Garen. "Why tomorrow night?" I smiled faintly. "Because tomorrow night is my ovulation period. If I could get pregnant on the first try, I wouldn't have to entangle myself with him repeatedly." Garen's face grew increasingly cold, but he didn't get angry. Instead, he called Hamilton Walsh to take me back to the villa. I didn't linger for even a second. I turned and walked out the door. A few steps away, I heard something breaking inside, but I didn't stop. Sometimes I truly despise myself. Even in this situation, when I was with Garen, I couldn't control my body's instincts. But then I thought, if I couldn't resist or stop it, I might as well lie back and enjoy it. If it hurt, I'd bite him, hit him if it was rough. I'd scold him, tick him if it felt good. I'd even respond to his kisses. Garen, with his handsome face, perfect physique, wealth, and power, was certainly better than a vibrator. Maybe he noticed I was spacing out, because his movements suddenly became more forceful. When my head almost hit the wall, he swiftly reached out to block it. "Alexia," he said, looking down at me. I didn't understand why, now that he had what he wanted. His eyes were still filled with unwillingness. What was he unwilling about? It made me laugh. Deep down, I could still feel the lingering pain from earlier. I frowned and kicked him. You hurt me. But Garen grabbed my ankle and pushed it higher. He lowered himself slowly. His eyes locked onto mine until we were fully connected. The depth was almost unbearable. Alexia, he said, lowering his head and forcefully, roughly kissing me. Tell me you love me, Alexia. Like before, every time we were together. Say you only love me. I had once said I loved him. Every time we were intimate, every time the passion reached its peak, the young and naive me would express my love repeatedly. Even in the most dangerous times, I would unhesitatingly shield him from harm. In fact, until our first breakup, I was still in love with him. Even when we reunited, I hadn't completely forgotten or let go of him. From childhood to adulthood, I wasn't the type who could love and hate with ease, picking up and letting go without difficulty. The first man I truly liked would inevitably leave a deep mark, but thanks to him, the wounds etched into my bones and flesh had not healed. They had festered, and this festering wound constantly reminded me that a man's so-called affection and love were the most worthless things in the world. In the end, I didn't say those words, and that night, Garen, with a lackluster interest, hastily finished and then got up to dress and leave the villa. Recently, everyone around Garen had noticed that he was in a bad mood. Alexia was in New York, but apart from that night, Garen had not visited the villa again. He occasionally returned to the Carroll family's old house, facing the elders who seemed to want to say something. Garen felt a strange sense of vindictive pleasure. The marriage was arranged by them. The daughter-in-law was chosen by them. Now that they wanted him to divorce and remarry, it was a slap in the face to them. But he refused to relent. At dinner, he ate only a few bites before getting up and leaving. The restaurant was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. Garen smirked and didn't look back. When his phone rang for a while, he finally took it out to check. It was a call from Alexia's maid. He abruptly stopped in his tracks. In the cold winter night, it felt as if an inexplicable warmth was rising from his chest. As he thought of something, he even managed a faint smile. Garen, Alexia has been sick for several days and wouldn't let us tell you. Tonight, she's running a high fever again. Dr. Jian came to give her an IV, but Alexia won't cooperate. I'm coming right away. Garen hung up the phone and didn't have the driver follow him. The 50-minute drive took him less than half an hour to complete. The bedroom was a mess, with pillows and blankets scattered everywhere. Alexia, with her hair in disarray, was curled up in the corner of the bed, refusing to let anyone approach. You all go out first, he said, handing his coat to the maid with a calm tone. Everyone left the room. He walked to the bedside step by step. Alexia, the small, curled-up figure, shivered slightly. His hand came down, gently stroking her disheveled hair. She didn't seem to resist much. He moved closer, holding her thin shoulders and embracing her. Her body was burning hot, making his heart ache. Alexia, is your stomach hurting again? After the knife wound, she had developed a side effect. The healed wound would cause phantom pain. Whenever she got sick, she would have nightmares about that day, about the face of the attacker. Only Garen knew this. Don't be afraid. There's nothing wrong. It's all over. He held her tightly, patiently comforting her. That person was caught by the police and will never get out of prison. You're okay now. The wound is healing well, and the scar is almost gone. Garen gently stroked her back and leaned down to kiss her softly. Alexia, don't be afraid. I'm here. Through the haze of her fever, she slowly opened her eyes. After a while, she recognized the person in front of her. But in that moment of recognition, she seemed to relax a bit. Tears then began to fall one by one. Her body was burning hot, but her fingers were icy cold. Clinging tightly to his sleeve, she said, Garen. It's me, Garen. Her eyes suddenly filled with a sense of grievance. Her grip on his sleeve tightened like a child who has been wronged and finally sees their family. She cried loudly. Why did you come back so late? That person was so fierce, and he hit me. Garen suddenly hugged her tightly. His eyes stung painfully, and he almost cried. When the incident first happened, Alexia often had such nightmares. He would stay with her all night, only leaving for one brief period. When he returned, she would hold him and cry like this. If it weren't for her illness and fever, she would never be so dependent on him again, never say such things. He knew this clearly, yet he was still immersed in it, savoring every moment. I'm sorry, Alexia. I came back late. I promise I will never leave you again, okay? Her emotions gradually calmed, and she nodded with a sniffle. You said so. You can't lie to me. Yes, I won't lie to you. I'll never deceive you again, she cried, but then suddenly looked up at him and smiled. Garen, I love you. He was stunned. His limbs seemed numb, unable to move. He didn't know how much time had passed, but she had already fallen into a deep sleep in his arms. He slowly began to regain his sense of reality. Alexia, he whispered, lowering his head to rest his face against her cheek. I love you too, Alexia. In early spring of the following year, I discovered I was pregnant. Whether it was due to my emotional state or the injury I sustained for Garen, my pregnancy was challenging. The first 3 months were mostly spent in a hospital for bed rest. During the second trimester of my pregnancy, things were relatively stable for a couple of months. My relationship with Garen seemed to have eased a bit. I heard his wife was still living in France. They didn't have a real marital relationship. I also heard that they have long since drafted a divorce agreement, but we're just waiting for a time to make it public in order to maximize their interests. But none of this concerned me. I simply went about my routine, prenatal checkups, and took care of the baby. By the 5th month of my pregnancy, I could often feel the baby moving. It was a strange feeling, and sometimes I would uncontrollably tear up, but more often, it might have been the hormones playing tricks on me, making it impossible for me to ignore his presence. As winter approached in New York, my due date was only 20 days away, but on that very day, something unexpected happened. When Garen came home, I was sunbathing under the eaves. The sunlight was particularly warm, and there wasn't a breeze. I downsized off after a while. When I woke up, the maid told me that Garen had arrived. I just acknowledged it and didn't think much of it. I had a small bowl of warm porridge from the kitchen and then went upstairs. As I passed by Garen's study, I hadn't intended to stop or listen to the conversation inside, but inadvertently, I'd overheard some very familiar names from Garen's conversation: fathers, my father's superiors, and mine. Once the baby is born, I'll find another way to slowly make her change her mind, Garen said. A woman carrying a child for 10 months could never bear to part with her own flesh and blood. Forget about Alexia's father. Don't bring it up again. It ends here. Let it rot in your belly. Seal the lips of those involved from the start. I don't want to hear another word about this. This method is only good for one use. Too much is overdoing it. You know, my only aim is to get her, not to harm her family. I'm still soft-hearted about her and those related to her. Standing outside the study, with my hands resting on my protruding belly, it was at that moment that I foolishly understood I had been trapped from the start. From the beginning, he had been plotting against me. The calamity that befell my loved ones was orchestrated by him. But what was I, Alexia, to deserve such attention from a man like Garen? Why go to such lengths just to have me? Or did he think someone like him didn't deserve pure affection? Didn't he believe that anyone could love him simply for who he was? Was I pitiable, or was Garen pitiable? I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't. My abdomen was cramping with pain, as if a knife were cutting through my flesh. A moment later, a warm gush of blood suddenly flowed out, spilling onto the floor in a pool of crimson. When I closed my eyes in a daze, I heard a chaotic mix of Wesley's servants' frantic shouts, Garen's trembling voice, and his cold, shaking hands. I wanted to open my eyes and see how pitifully disheveled he looked at that moment, but I simply didn't have the strength. I felt exhausted, so exhausted that I just wanted to sleep. In early winter in New York, I gave birth to a baby boy, Garen's first child. Due to severe bleeding, I was very weak. On the 3rd day after the birth, I managed to regain some strength. Garen came to my bedside, holding the baby wrapped in a blue blanket. My gaze barely skimmed his face before I immediately looked away. Alexia, look at him. He has your eyebrows and mouth, Garen said, carefully handing the baby to me with a hopeful expression. But I turned my face away and closed my eyes. I'm tired. I want to rest for a while. Garen stared at me for a while before saying, okay, then you rest. I'll take him out. I kept my eyes shut, listening to his footsteps fading away. The door opened and then closed. The silence that followed was overwhelming. A blurry image of the baby's face appeared before my closed eyes and mouth just like mine. A lump of flesh that had been inside me for almost 10 months. How could it not hurt to sever that connection? But I had no other choice. I couldn't bear to look at him, even for a second. If I did, I wouldn't be able to let go. A week after the baby was born, I woke up from my nap to find a thin brown paper bag by my pillow. Inside was a document with the words "divorce agreement" written on it. I glanced at it and then put it back. His marriage had nothing to do with me, so his divorce was also none of my concern. I wouldn't be like the heroines in romance novels, who think they can make the powerful bow down completely. As Garen had said before, his marriage was a transaction for maximizing benefits. So, the divorce was just because it no longer served any purpose, not because of me. In the afternoon, Garen brought the baby to my hospital room again. By then, I was able to get out of bed and move around a bit, so I started to tidy up my things. When he came in and saw the untouched paper bag on my bedside, his expression darkened, but he quickly composed himself, holding the baby and coming over to me. Alexia, see if he's hungry. He's opening his little mouth, looking for food, he said, placing the blue blanket in front of me. I turned my face away. If he's hungry, let the nanny feed him formula. I wouldn't even look at him, let alone breastfeed. Garen smiled. Do you believe it? I'm the one feeding him now. I said nothing, just stared out the window. Garen continued. I even learned how to change diapers. He eats a lot and keeps us up 2 or 3 times a night. He seems to have gained some weight these past few days. His cheeks are so chubby. Do you want to take a look? Saying this, he placed the baby next to me. I'm going to make a call. Alexia, watch him for a moment. Before I could say anything, Garen had already walked out of the room. The baby started crying, searching with his little mouth and then bursting into tears. At the sound of his cry, my heart ached sharply. Instinctively, I wanted to pick him up, but when I reached out, I hardened my resolve. I turned and went straight to the bathroom. Standing in front of the mirror, tears streamed down my face. The crying outside continued for a while before it stopped. Probably the nanny had taken him away. I wiped my tears and felt that the empty, silent room was like a bottomless abyss, swallowing everything. Every second felt unbearable. The day I left, the weather wasn't great. It seemed that every day leaving New York was always dreary. I said I wanted to take a walk in the small garden downstairs and didn't let the caregiver follow me. I didn't take much. I left behind all the clothes and items I didn't need and only took my personal documents, so they didn't suspect anything. I called a cab directly to the airport. As we neared the airport, I suddenly noticed a familiar car speeding behind us. Garen's coat was somewhat disheveled, his hair a bit tousled. A tall, handsome man holding a crying baby immediately drew all eyes to him. I wrapped my heavy coat tighter and put on my hat before taking my bag and getting out of the car. Garen caught up, his eyes red as he looked at me. Alexia, if you don't want me, that's fine. But now, you don't even want your own child. I couldn't hold back a tear, but I didn't turn around. I just stared at the vast, free sky in the distance and said calmly, yes, I don't want you or the baby. Alexia, can your heart be even colder? I smiled. Yes, it can. Garen, do you know? Being with you for nearly a year made every moment feel like a living hell. If you break our previous agreement this time. I slowly turned around and looked at him with indifference. I will feel disgusted every time I think of you for the rest of my life. After I said this, Garen didn't utter another word. He held the baby tighter and turned away. Striding off, I walked forward into the terminal without looking back. I didn't know that at the moment I was stepping forward, Garen had stopped, watching me walk away step by step. Neither of us knew that would be the last time we'd see each other in this lifetime. At 35, I quietly married again. After all the twists and turns, my partner was still joyous. After his career had stabilized, he had also married through an arranged match, but that marriage lasted only 3 years. His wife gave birth to a daughter, and when the daughter was 1, they divorced amicably. Joyce never remarried for the sake of their daughter. It wasn't until the daughter started elementary school that Joyce and I unexpectedly reconnected. Our relationship was very natural and unremarkable. There were no dramatic scenes, no earth-shattering moments. It was like a cup of warm water or a bowl of warm porridge, but it was the ordinary life I had longed for. Due to severe bleeding during childbirth, I found it difficult to conceive again, but I didn't want another child. Joyce had considered it, but knowing my health condition, he gave up on the idea. Our married life was ordinary. Joyce treated me well, and his daughter gradually grew closer to me. Sometimes, while brushing her hair or buying clothes, I would have a fleeting thought of that baby, but it was just a fleeting moment. His name is Daniel. After all these years, he remains Garen's only child. He has not remarried, has no new wife, no legitimate children, and no other illegitimate children. Daniel was included in the Carroll family genealogy from birth. He is Garen's eldest son and, possibly, his only child. He will inherit everything Garen had. This was the one thing I could secure for myself, the greatest benefit I could gain. I brought him into this world. I have never loved him for even a single day. I am not a competent mother. He can resent me. He can also ignore me. I think I can accept either with calmness. My life has been nothing more than that of an ordinary, everyday woman. I never aspired to fight through thorns and tread on edges to feed into a world that doesn't belong to me. That's why I can so clearly and rationally let go of everything in New York. Garen once said I have a hard heart. Looking back, it seems that's not far from the truth. I loved him, but not more than I love myself, and perhaps that's one of the deepest reasons for his dissatisfaction with me. As for Garen, whether he likes me or loves me, maybe even he can't say for sure, and I have long since stopped caring.
Actually, before I turned 18, I had seen my biological mother a few times, but I only watched her from a distance and never approached her. The first time I saw her, her then husband came to pick her up from work. She walked gently to the car, smiling warmly. There was a little girl who got out of the car, slightly younger than me. The girl rushed over to hug her and called her mommy. She smiled and patted the girl's hair, then led her into the car and they drove away. I stood by the roadside for a long time until the car disappeared from sight, before slowly returning to the hotel. My father was smoking on the terrace and, seeing me return, smiled and waved me over. When I walked over, I noticed his eyes were slightly red, but I didn't ask him about it. I was 14 then, and it was the first time I drank a little with my father. I quickly got drunk and had a dream. In the dream, she came to pick me up from school. She patted my hair and held my hand as we got into the car, smiling gently. I cried and continued crying from the dream until I woke up. It was the first and last time I cried as an adult. The second time I saw her, she was alone. She carried a bag and bought a few flowers at a flower shop. Passing by a bubble tea store, she bought an ice cream. After finishing one, she felt it wasn't enough and bought a second one. I couldn't help but laugh, thinking she looked like a little girl eating ice cream. Later, she received a phone call and seemed flustered. Reluctantly, she threw the half-eaten ice cream into the trash. Yet, there was a smile in her eyes, and she looked very happy. I had never liked sweets, but that day I bought 2 ice creams. When I brought them back, my father saw them. "Why suddenly ice cream?" he asked, but then took one. We silently finished the ice creams without mentioning her, but we both knew we were thinking about her. When I turned 18, I was about to go abroad for studies. It was my last visit to see her. Maybe it was the maternal bond, but she seemed to sense my presence. Although she never turned around to look back, she went past a trendy store that sold wish plaques, which you could write on and hang on a wishing tree outside. She went in for about 10 minutes and then hurriedly called a cab. When I walked over, the store staff stopped me. They gave me a wish plaque that a lady had asked them to give to me. The plaque was simple, with a few elegant characters written on it, probably her handwriting. It read, "Wish for Daniel, safety and health." Holding the wooden plaque, tears suddenly streamed down my face. Perhaps it was because our mother-child bond was so thin in this life. If there is a next life, I would like to be that little girl, to have her smile and pat my head, holding my hand, step by step, moving forward. When I was 24, I returned from studying abroad. I discovered that my father was terminally ill. When he saw me, despite his long illness, he seemed somewhat comforted and spoke a lot, which was rare. But soon, he fell back into his final state. In his last moments, he kept repeating a name, Alexia, Alexia. I knew his regret and the unfulfilled wish he had. I had initially agreed with him not to disturb her peaceful life, but ultimately, because of the blood connection, I couldn't resist. I met with her and told her that my father was dying and could pass away at any moment. She looked calm, but sat there with her hands trembling, not speaking for a long time. I made an excuse to get some hot drinks to give her a moment alone. When I came back, her eyes were red. She had probably cried. I couldn't describe the feeling inside me, but I was somewhat glad for my father. She had cried over his death. She must have had some place for him in her heart. I asked her if she could come with me to New York to see my father one last time. She didn't refuse. However, when we arrived in New York and the plane had just landed, we received news that my father had passed away. In his final moments, his only son was not by his side, and the woman he had never forgotten also didn't get to see him one last time. She stood there, looking at me with a mix of confusion and helplessness. I didn't say anything. I just hugged her tightly. "Dad is gone, but you still have me. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, Mom." She finally trembled and raised her hand to gently hug me. Her tears fell, drop by drop, burning hot. She cried for a while and then raised her hand to touch my face, saying, "Daniel, you will have a hard time from now on." Yes, I am my father's only child. When he was ill, he had already made a will, dividing everything equally between me and her. I knew she wouldn't want it, but it didn't matter. I would manage everything well for her. No matter what people said or how they tried to defame her, I always remembered what my father told me. She was the one who gave me life and fought to bring me into this world. I must love her with all I have. After all, in this world, she and I are the closest family to each other. "Mom," I whispered her name again. The title I had secretly called out in dreams 1,000 times was finally said aloud. "Mom, as long as you're here, I'm not afraid of any hardship." She wiped her tears and looked at me with relief in her eyes. "Daniel, let's go. We'll send your father off one last time." She held my hand. Her hand was soft, warm, and strong. I let her hold me, step by step, moving forward. The story is now complete. Please subscribe to the channel to get the latest updates. New novels are updated every day.